So in the first 4 verses, what he's saying, look, the system of the law, the old covenant, was not the reality. It was only a shadow of the reality that was to come. And being only a shadow, the sacrifices and offerings that were in it could not make the sinner perfect. It just could not perfect him. And he says, look, if you don't believe me, then here is a question for you. Why didn't the sacrifices and offerings cease? Why did they continue to be offered every day and every year and so forth if the sinner was made perfect? If the sinner was made perfect, then he should no longer have consciousness of sin. He should no longer feel the need to make reconciliation for his sins and atonement for them. But the fact that they continued to be offered every year and every day is evidence that the sinner was still conscious of his sin, which means he was not made perfect. Why? Because the sacrifices which represented sin were a reminder of his present sin. Right? And he says in verse 4, this is so because it was impossible for the blood or the life of bulls and goats to take away sin. Then going on, he says, wherefore, when he cometh into the world, he saith, sacrifices and offerings thou would not, but a body hast thou prepared me. In burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin, thou hast no pleasure. Then said I, lo, I come in the volume of the book. It is written of me to do thy will, O God. So he's saying, that's why when Jesus came into the world, it was prophesied of him that he would not come to offer sacrifices and offerings, for that would not and could not do what God desired. God would prepare a body for him. And then he says that God had no pleasure in those burnt sacrifices and the offerings for sin. Now, it does not mean that God was not the one who instructed or instituted the sacrificial system. That's not what it means. It was God who instructed it and instituted it, right? But there is a sense in which it was not accepted in the sight of God, and he did not desire it. This sense lies in the fact that it did not accomplish what God needed to be accomplished. They did not perfect the sinner. They could not give the sinner a complete and a total sense of security and acceptance with God. And the author of this letter is pointing to the fact that they kept being offered every day, and the Jewish year kept repeating every year, repeat the same thing, repeat the same thing. He's pointing to this fact as an evidence that it could not accomplish what God wanted accomplished. It could not perfect the conscience of the sinner or of the worshipper. Then he goes on to say, above when he says, sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and offerings for sin, thou wouldst not, neither hadst pleasure therein, which are offered by the law. Then said he, lo, I come to do thy will, O God. He taketh away the first, that he may establish the second. So by saying that God had no pleasure and did not want sacrifices and offerings for sin that were required by the old covenant, then following that he said, I come to do thy will. That's talking about Christ, obviously. Christ came to do the will of God. And he concludes, it is obvious then that he intended to replace the sacrifices and offerings with the will of God. That's why he says, he takes away the first, that the sacrifices and offerings, that he might establish the second, the will of God. Now, there is a link between the sacrifices and offerings and the will of God. We always talk about type and antitype. Well, this verse tells us that the antitype of the sacrifices and offerings is the will of God, or is the fulfilling of the will of God. Now we know that the antitype of the sacrifice is Christ dying on the cross, right? So the antitype is actually the fulfilling of the will of God in the sacrifice of Christ. What does that mean? You see, by his life, death, and resurrection, Jesus fulfilled the will of God. By his life, he fulfilled all righteousness. He lived in perfect harmony with the will of God. By his death, he condemned sin in the flesh. He conquered sin, fulfilling the will of God in perfecting a human life that is free from sin. And by his resurrection, he fulfilled the will of God in imparting this perfect life to humanity. You see, the sacrificial system or the sacrifice in the Old Covenant typified few things. One, it typified granting pardon to the sinner. When the sinner went and laid hand on the sacrifice, in a way, the sin was transferred from the sinner to the lamb. So the sin is no longer on him. He had pardon. It also typified taking sin away from the sinner by transferring it to the sacrifice. And it also typified putting sin to death or doing away with sin, right? But the sacrificial system could not perfectly represent the reality that God had in mind. It could not give the sinner life. It could not give the sinner a perfect conscience of this perfect unity with God. You see, the sacrifice that the sinner brought to the sanctuary was slain and died, and it stayed dead. Nothing came back from the sacrifice or the animal back to the sinner. It was just transfer of sin, or symbolically, and that's where it ended. The sacrifice died. But not so with the reality. Yes, Christ died, but he did not stay dead. He came back to life, and hence he is able to give his life to humanity. A life that is free from sin, a life that is free from the curse of the law, a life that is fully united with God. This, the shadow which is found in the law, could not do, because it just was not the perfect reality. It was not the very image, but it found its fulfillment in Christ. So this fulfilled the will of God in uniting us to himself. What God was saying through the sacrificial system is that he is going to find a way, he's going to initiate a way in which he's going to reconcile man to himself. That's what we read in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 19. We read, to wit, that God was in Christ reconciling the world unto himself, not imputing their trespasses unto them, and has committed unto us the word of reconciliation. It was God's will for us to be fully reconciled to him. His will was to unite humanity back to himself. And the sacrificial system could not do that. But Christ, by coming to do the will of God, by fulfilling the will of God, actually accomplished that. He united humanity with divinity. He united the human race with God.